November 18, 2024. Tokyo woke up to a diplomatic slap it didn't see coming. After months of careful preparation, quiet back-channel negotiations, and what Japanese officials believed were positive signals from Beijing, China delivered a message that stunned Japan's foreign ministry. No, not now. Not interested. Japan had extended an olive branch, a high-level diplomatic outreach aimed at stabilizing relations, reducing tensions, and finding common ground on economic and security issues. Prime Minister Fumio Kishida's government had invested significant political capital in this effort. They'd softened rhetoric, made concessions on trade issues, and signaled flexibility on disputed territories. And China said no. Publicly, bluntly. With language so sharp it left no room for misinterpretation. The rejection wasn't just diplomatic protocol. It was calculated humiliation. Timed for maximum impact. Delivered in a way that sent a message not just to Tokyo, but to Washington, Seoul, and every other capital watching the Indo-Pacific chess game. So what really happened on November 18th? Why did China reject Japan's outreach after months of what appeared to be warming relations? And what does this mean for the future of Asia's most important and most complicated bilateral relationship? This is the real story behind the headlines. The one that reveals not just what China said, but why it said it, and what Japan's mistake tells us about the new rules of geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific. Let's start with the outreach itself. Because to understand why it failed, you need to understand what Japan was actually trying to accomplish. For the past 2 years, Japan has been walking a diplomatic tightrope. On one hand, it's deepened its military alliance with the United States, increased defense spending, strengthened ties with Australia, India, and Southeast Asian nations, explicitly identified China as its greatest security challenge. But on the other hand, Japan cannot afford a complete breakdown with China. The economic ties are too deep. Chinese tourists, Chinese students, Chinese investment, and Chinese trade all matter enormously to Japan's economy. Completely antagonizing Beijing isn't just risky, it's economically suicidal. So Tokyo has tried to compartmentalize, keep security issues in one box, economic engagement in another, territorial disputes frozen but not forgotten. It's a strategy sometimes called competitive coexistence. Compete where necessary, cooperate where possible. The outreach that began earlier this year was part of this strategy. Japan proposed high-level talks on economic cooperation, especially in green technology and infrastructure development in third countries. It suggested confidence-building measures to reduce the risk of military accidents in the East China Sea. It even hinted at flexibility on the Senkaku Islands dispute, suggesting joint resource development in contested waters. These were significant gestures. The Senkaku Islands, called Diao by China, have been a flashpoint for decades. Japan controls them. China claims them. Coast Guard vessels from both countries regularly face off in the surrounding waters. Any Japanese flexibility on this issue would be politically risky in Tokyo, but Japanese officials believed the timing was right. President Xi Jinping had recently softened rhetoric toward several Asian neighbors. China's economy was struggling with slow growth, a real estate crisis, and declining foreign investment. Beijing appeared to be prioritizing economic stabilization over confrontation. Throughout the summer and fall, Japanese diplomats worked the problem. Back-channel communications, track-2 dialogues involving academics and retired officials, careful signaling through media interviews and policy speeches. Everything indicated that Beijing was at least open to dialogue. Then came November 18th. The rejection was delivered in the most public way possible. China's foreign ministry spokesperson stood at the daily press briefing and was asked about Japan's proposal for high-level talks. The response was brief and brutal. Japan's words and actions on issues concerning China's core interests have been inconsistent and insincere. Under current circumstances, the conditions for high-level dialogue are not mature. Japan knows what it needs to do to improve relations. That last line, Japan knows what it needs to do, is diplomatic code for unconditional demands. It means, we're not negotiating. We're telling you what to do. And until you comply, don't bother calling. Japanese officials were blindsided, not just by the rejection, but by the public nature of it. Typically, even when countries disagree, they preserve face by keeping rejections private. Diplomatic outreach that's declined usually results in a quiet note, at this time delivered through back channels. Going public means you want to embarrass the other side, and that's exactly what China did. Within hours, Chinese state media amplified the message. Articles appeared describing Japan as a vassal of American imperialism. Editorials condemned Japanese military expansion and its support for Taiwan. Social media influencers on Chinese platforms launched coordinated attacks on Japanese policy. The message was clear. Japan had been put in its place, and the world was watching. So what went wrong? Why did an outreach that seemed carefully calibrated and based on what Japan believed were positive signals end in such spectacular failure? The answer lies in what happened between the time Japan planned its outreach and November 18. Because the geopolitical landscape shifted in ways Tokyo didn't fully account for. First, the Typhoon missile system deployment to the Philippines. This happened in April, and as we discussed earlier, it fundamentally changed the strategic calculus in the region. The United States demonstrated it was willing and able to position intermediate range strike capabilities within range of China's coast. China saw this as escalatory and provocative, but more importantly, China saw Japan's fingerprints on it. Even though the missiles went to the Philippines, not Japan, Beijing believed Tokyo had supported and enabled the deployment. Japanese officials had publicly praised the U.S. commitment to regional security. Japanese ports and bases had been used for logistics supporting the deployment. From Beijing's perspective, Japan was complicit. And you don't reward complicity with diplomatic engagement. Second, Japan's defense budget increase. In December 2023, Japan announced it would double defense spending over 5 years to reach 2% of GDP. This made Japan the third largest military spender in the world, after the United States and China. More significantly, Japan announced it would acquire long-range strike capabilities, Tomahawk cruise missiles with a range of over 1,000 miles, enough to reach deep into Chinese territory from Japanese soil. Japan framed this as defensive, a necessary response to the deteriorating security environment. Beijing saw it as offensive buildup and a direct threat. Third, Taiwan. Japan had become increasingly explicit in its support for Taiwan. Prime Minister Kishida stated publicly that a Taiwan emergency would be a Japan emergency. Japanese officials participated in Track 2 dialogues with Taiwanese counterparts, and critically, Japan deepened its security coordination with the United States, specifically around Taiwan contingency planning. For China, Taiwan is the ultimate red line. Any perception that Japan is actively supporting Taiwanese independence or preparing to intervene militarily in a Taiwan conflict is absolutely unacceptable. Fourth, and perhaps most important, domestic politics in China. President Xi Jinping is facing his own pressures. The economy is struggling. Youth unemployment is high. The real estate sector is in crisis. Foreign investment is declining. In this environment, Xi cannot afford to look weak on national security issues. Engaging with Japan, while Japan is deepening military ties with the United States and supporting Taiwan, would be portrayed by nationalist voices in China as appeasement. She doesn't need that political headache. So when Japan's outreach came, Xi's government faced a choice: engage and risk domestic backlash, or reject and send a strong signal about China's resolve. They chose the latter. But there's another layer to this. And it's the one that reveals the most about how China thinks about its relationship with Japan. China doesn't see Japan as an independent actor. It sees Japan as an extension of American power in Asia. Every Japanese policy decision is viewed through the lens of US strategy. When Japan increases defense spending, China sees American pressure. When Japan supports Taiwan, China sees American manipulation. This means that no matter what Japan offers in bilateral talks, China believes the real decision-maker is in Washington, not Tokyo. So why negotiate with Japan when the real issue is with the United States? This is deeply frustrating for Japan because it denies Japanese agency. Tokyo insists it makes its own decisions based on its own interests, and to a large degree, that's true. But from Beijing's perspective, as long as Japan maintains its security alliance with the United States, it cannot be treated as a truly independent power. This creates a fundamental asymmetry. Japan wants a bilateral relationship with China based on mutual respect and sovereign equality. China offers a relationship based on hierarchy, where Japan's place in the order is below China and defined by its relationship with the United States. The November 18th rejection was China making this hierarchy explicit. You don't get to deepen military cooperation with our adversary and then ask us for economic favors. You don't get to support Taiwan independence forces and then expect friendly dialogue. You make a choice. For Japan, this is an impossible demand, because choosing China over the United States means abandoning the security guarantee that has underpinned Japanese defense policy for 70 years. It means gambling that China will respect Japanese sovereignty and interests without the deterrent of American military power. No Japanese government can make that bet. The risks are too high. The trust is too low. So Japan is caught. It needs economic engagement with China, but it needs security protection from the United States. And increasingly, it cannot have both. The rejection also reveals something about timing. China chose November 18th deliberately. It came just weeks before a planned US-Japan-South Korea trilateral summit. It came as Japan was hosting ASEAN leaders for a major economic conference. It came when Japan was trying to position itself as a leader in Indo-Pacific diplomacy. By rejecting Japan publicly at this moment, China accomplished several goals simultaneously. It embarrassed Tokyo on the world stage. It demonstrated that Japan's regional leadership has limits. It sent a warning to other countries considering closer security ties with the United States. And it reminded Washington that its alliance system in Asia is fragile. This is strategic messaging operating on multiple levels. It's not just about Japan. It's about the broader contest for influence in Asia. Now, what does this mean going forward? Because diplomatic rejections aren't permanent, relationships shift, circumstances change. At some point, China and Japan will engage again. The question is on what terms and under what conditions. In the short term, expect relations to remain cold. Japan will likely double down on its US alliance and regional partnerships. China will continue pressuring Japan through economic, diplomatic, and military means. The risk of accidental conflict in the East China Sea will remain high. Japanese officials are reportedly furious about the public humiliation. There are calls in Tokyo for a tougher response. Some voices argue Japan should stop trying to appease Beijing and instead focus entirely on building deterrence and alliance strength. This plays into a broader debate in Japan about its China policy. One camp believes engagement is still possible and necessary. They argue that economic interdependence creates incentives for both sides to manage competition peacefully. They point out that despite tensions, trade continues. People-to-people exchanges happen, and pragmatic cooperation on issues like climate change remains possible. The other camp argues that engagement is naive. They believe China respects only strength and that any Japanese gesture of goodwill will be interpreted as weakness. They advocate for a policy of pressure and containment, working with the United States and other democracies to limit Chinese power and influence. The November 18th rejection strengthens the second camp. It provides evidence that Chinese engagement is conditional and that Beijing uses dialogue as a tool of manipulation rather than genuine reconciliation. But here's the paradox. Even those in Japan who advocate a hardline approach don't want a complete break with China. They still recognize the economic importance. They still want channels of communication to reduce the risk of war. They still hope that at some point, a more stable relationship is possible. The question is how to get there. And after November 18th, that path looks more difficult than ever. For China, the rejection serves its interests in the short term. It reinforces deterrence. It punishes behavior Beijing opposes. It demonstrates resolve. But in the long term, It deepens Japanese threat perceptions and accelerates exactly the military buildup and alliance, strengthening that China claims to oppose. This is the security dilemma in action. China's effort to pressure Japan into better behavior makes Japan feel less secure, which drives Japan to take actions that make China feel less secure, which leads to more pressure from China, and the cycle continues. Breaking this cycle requires one side to take a risk, to make a gesture that isn't immediately reciprocated but creates space for the other side to respond. Japan tried to do this with its outreach. China rejected it. The ball is now in Beijing's court. If China wants better relations with Japan, it needs to signal what would be acceptable, not vague demands like you know what you need to do, but specific, achievable steps. Does China want Japan to reduce defense spending? Stop security cooperation with Taiwan? Withdraw from the Quad? These are non-starters for Tokyo, but at least they would clarify what's actually being demanded. Or does China simply want Japan to acknowledge Chinese dominance in Asia, to accept a subordinate role in a China-led regional order? If that's the real demand, then no amount of Japanese outreach will ever succeed, because no Japanese government can agree to that. The ambiguity serves Chinese interests in some ways. It keeps Japan off balance. It maintains pressure without committing to specific outcomes, but it also makes genuine reconciliation impossible. So we're left with a relationship that's stuck, too important to completely break, too contentious to genuinely repair, managed through crisis, stabilized through mutual exhaustion, and always one miscalculation away from something worse. November 18th was just the latest chapter in this long, difficult story. Japan tried, China said no, and the Indo-Pacific became a little more tense, a little more unstable, and a little more dangerous. The real story isn't just that China rejected Japan's outreach, it's that the rejection reveals how fundamentally the two countries disagree about what their relationship should be. Japan wants partnership between equals. China wants hierarchy with Chinese primacy. And that gap may be What happens next depends on factors beyond either country's control. If the US-China relationship stabilizes, space may open for Japan-China dialogue. If a Taiwan crisis erupts, Japan will be forced to choose sides in the most consequential way possible. If China's economy deteriorates further, Beijing may recalculate the costs of isolation. But for now, the message from November 18th is clear. China is not interested in Japanese friendship on Japanese terms. It's interested in Japanese compliance on Chinese terms. And until Japan is willing to fundamentally realign its foreign policy in ways that compromise its security and sovereignty, Beijing has no incentive to engage. Tokyo got the message. The question is what it does with it. Because in geopolitics, being rejected isn't just about hurt feelings. It's about recalculating interests, reassessing strategies, and deciding whether to try again or move on. Japan is deciding right now, and that decision will shape the future of Asia for years to come. The story of November 18th isn't over. It's just beginning, because every diplomatic rejection is also a choice. And the choices made in response will determine whether this was a temporary setback or the moment when Japan and China began drifting toward something much worse. The real story isn't what happened on November 18th. It's what happens next. And nobody knows how that story ends.